Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast, proudly powered by Firefly Recovery, Engage Movement, and Pura Health Ultrasound. Joining me today on the podcast is Andrew Marsh. Andrew and I dive into the weeds around speed training. Great episode. You're going to love it. Forgot to mention this episode. It's also brought to you by the Braun Performance and Rehab Collective. Check that out in the description below for all things strength and conditioning, post-rehab, and so on from an online programming standpoint. Enjoy. Andrew, welcome to the podcast. Super excited to work with you today, man. For people who aren't familiar with you and all the amazing stuff you're doing down there in Florida, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all you got going on, man?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Andrew Marsh. Go by Drew to most of my athletes, but basically moved down here in 2017. I graduated with a degree in exercise science from University of South Carolina. Moved down here for an internship with the company I'm currently director for. But basically over the years, kind of worked my way up from an intern, unpaid intern, paid intern, uh, sports performance coach into the director of the facility into 2021. So just working from there, trying to grow it as much as possible, build up the client base. Basically, the facility that we specialize in speed mechanics and speed development for our athletes, whether it's track athletes or lacrosse, football, soccer, baseball, softball, kind of across the gamut. And then we work with wrestling, and there's some judo athletes and stuff as well that come in for us. So really, any sport, any athlete, we try to develop the best personalized program for them based on injury history, what their sport demands, uh, doing an initial assessment, any mobility or flexibility issues, anything we're seeing with instability, imbalances, stuff like that. So just kind of a comprehensive program, but with the specialization in the speed development and designing those strength and conditioning programs that are going to help complement that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first off, big on South Carolina. Huge shout out to Jay Patel. Runs a great lab down there. All the
Mhm.
work that's being done there is absolutely incredible. So it's great. You're an alum of one of those prestigious universities in Propen, when it sounds like
Absolutely.
you've been absolutely crushing it ever since you went to Florida. And it's funny because we've had some similar conversations with people in the past about their career pathways and so on that way. And that could be a topic for another day. But as you mentioned, you work with a wide array of athletes, but it seems to be centralized around speed. And this is something I've seen. Everyone kind of trains a little bit differently. Everyone's got
Mhm.
kind of their own philosophies around and so on that way. But ultimately, athletes have realized that they need to be really fast on the
Oh,
field.
yeah.
And it's
Mhm.
interesting to me because I've noticed, at least on my own side, that there's a notable difference between game speed and what I would call like testing speed. So what I mean
Definitely.
by that
Oh, yeah.
is sometimes the athletes that are the fastest on the fly 10 are not the fastest on the field. The ones
Exactly.
that are fastest on the 40 are not always the fastest on the field. Now, sometimes they are, and it's great when that carryover occurs. But sometimes there's a little bit of a disconnect there. Would love to hear your thoughts on kind of like the test speed versus the game speed, if you will, and kind of which one you prioritize more that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I couldn't agree more. I do think that a lot of times you do see that with athletes. And I think one of the biggest factors in that, the kind of the dividing factor between the two, is really kind of the psychological component of it. So working with athletes, it's super easy. And you'll notice it a lot working with younger athletes like we do. We work with middle to high school predominantly and then college and pros. But athletes tend to get into their head. There's a lot of different personalities that you're working with. And a lot of those athletes are, depending on how you're coaching them and how you're cueing them, start to really overthink things. So, and even us as coaches, I know I myself, when I'm working on specific stuff for myself, I tend to get in my own head and be thinking too much about where am I striking the ground, how quick am I off the ground, am I punching my knees up properly, stuff like that. And that's going to really kind of take away from having the movement really flow and be more natural. So, I think from that game speed to training speed, when you're training, it's a much more controlled environment. You're much more mentally focused on very specific aspects. Whereas when you get into the game situation, you're just kind of more focused on the game, your body's moving. And so the training component, we're trying to give them enough reps with good technique and good volume to where that can transfer over to the game situation where they're not thinking about it and they don't have to. So I think the focus on developing it in a training facility and facilitating that. training experience where you're not allowing the athletes to get too in their head with it is going to have a greater transfer over to the sport specific side when they're actually on the field competing. And that really kind of goes into how you're coaching the athletes, whether it's a more internal cue or an external cue.
Absolutely, and in those training blocks, you can really break it up into a part-whole component, right? You mentioned the mechanics and the learning strategies and so on that way, and as you mentioned, no athlete is thinking about that in competition, right? You
Exactly.
take
Yep.
a wide out in a football game, they're thinking about, "Did I catch the ball and can I go?" They're not thinking about, "Oh, did I bring my knee up to the correct angle, or did I get enough of a toe off in my foot?" Or whatever it is that way.
Mhm.
No one's thinking about that. So
Yeah.
I think that it really allows you to hone in on specific things. And I think that brings up another concept. You've mentioned a few times the mechanics and some of the different training elements that way. It
Mhm.
sounds like that's something you all really hone in on. And I've seen some of this debates, I guess I want to say, about that, where some people feel that that stuff is super essential, super important. We need to, optimize mechanics. I hate the word optimize, but we need to optimize their mechanics or adjust their mechanics or whatever, versus other people don't even bother to assess it. They don't look at it and they just say, hey, they're going to run like they're going to run.
Mhm.
Where we kind of sit in that mechanics side of things that way. And what do we do to actually adjust or alter the way someone sprints or the way someone runs that way?
Yeah. So I think first off, it all kind of starts with the athlete's capacity to do that. So like with younger athletes, they're much more kind of pliable mentally, physically. They haven't solidified that habit. So I think with younger athletes, you can really, really hammer fundamental basics, trying to teach them to be like picture perfect mechanical output. Um, with older athletes who have already kind of solidified their mechanical base, it can be much more difficult to change those mechanics and make them more mechanically efficient. So in some instances, there, I think it's much more. You should be much more prioritized on how they're just interacting with the ground and stuff like that. So, getting them quicker off the ground, increasing their ability to produce force, and then produce it more rapidly to where the mechanics aren't necessarily changing too much. You're just focusing on the very fundamental aspects of quick contact, lots of force, propel yourself outward. So from that approach perspective, I think it really depends just on the age and the experience level of the athlete. From there, there's also of course, all the different factors that go into it: mobility, flexibility. Obviously, if someone's really tight in the hip flexors or the hips, the hamstrings, quads, stuff like that, that's going to really affect their ability to either drive the knee up to the position that you're ideally looking for them to get to, and stuff like that. So you've got to work within those types of parameters. But that's kind of where the strength conditioning component comes in too, because if you might have the perfect mechanics in the world, but if you don't have the ability to produce the force to complement those mechanics, you're not going to run any faster. But then kids who are really explosive, really strong naturally, and have really terrible mechanics can still outperform the kids who have perfect mechanics because they have that ability to produce force more in that direction than they do on the mechanical side. So I think like really just trying to find that middle ground with any given athlete where are we able to establish a good foundation of mechanics with their age and experience level and then build off of that? Or do they have a good foundation from the strength, fast twitch side to then try and work in as much of a mechanical basis as we can without overcomplicating things and getting them to actually underperform what they could be able to do?
And to your point on the force, I've seen a lot of athletes lately that find ways to run fast.
Hmm.
Yet when you test them in isolation, whether that's, using any of this wonderful tech that exists that way, you'll realize individually their muscles are not producing near enough force. And even if you do something compound like a belt squat or a thigh pull, you look
Hmm.
at what they get and it's like, why are we only 350 pounds of force on an IMTP, right?
Yeah.
Like
Hmm.
you're an 18-year-old football lineman. That number should be like double that,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
my opinion,
Absolutely.
right? Like it's amazing how these athletes are able to find unique ways to produce force
Hmm.
that allow them to perform the way we see in the game. But when we kind of isolate it out from a assessment or sports science or whatever the heck you want to call it standpoint, those capabilities are not there from the individualized muscles or even just isolated positions that way. And I think to your point, I've personally seen a lot of mechanical improvement in different populations by
Mhm.
literally just improving their ability to produce force
Oh
or
yeah.
produce force at higher speeds. And I think a lot of times, you know, we get so caught up in these millions of different drills and millions of different repetitions of stuff in order to
Mhm.
try and, you know, correct form or mechanics or whatever. And a lot of times, if we just improve the body's ability to produce force and produce force quickly the
Mhm.
place that needs to, it almost takes care of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the big components to your point, one of the big things that we talk about when we do an initial assessment, right, is looking at we break down acceleration, we break down top speed mechanics. When you look at the leg cycle, a lot of that reflexive snap through of the knees into the position that allows you then to strike the ground again into your leg cycle. That's due to the strength in the hip flexors and the ability to react to the ground with the ankle, that spring in the ankle, that rebound from the hip flexor when sprinting. So if the hip flexors, regardless, you could be focusing on having the knee pass through, but if those hip flexors aren't going to be strong enough to withstand the forces of sprinting to get that kind of rebound effect, right? That's just not going to happen. So I think explaining to incoming clients like we're trying to strength we're not we're these are the mechanics we want you to have ideally, but without developing that strength in the weight room and developing that elasticity to be able to actually perform that way, it's the two aren't gonna it's gonna be very disjointed. It's not really gonna work out. So that's where kind of having the strength conditioning component and the speed and agility component combined is what's going to really affect and help with that.
Absolutely, and you mentioned you assess acceleration, top end speed, and so on that way, and I've heard a lot of people assess this a lot of different ways.
Mhm.
What's your kind of approach or philosophy around assessing an athlete from a linear speed standpoint?
Sure. So basically, we'll get their baseline numbers for their 10, 20, 30, 40 yard dash times. The length of our turf in the facility doesn't go much longer than that. So just trying to get those base kind of splits. From there, and when we're doing that, we're getting video of their mechanics. So what we can do is we'll take a look, we'll bring them into the office, we'll take a look at the side view of their sprints, we'll look at their extension, or we'll look at their angle to the ground off takeoff. We'll look at their initial start, seeing if that's going to affect anything because that start is going to play a pivotal role in how well they're going to propel themselves outward. But we'll look initially for the acceleration at the angle to the ground, followed by the triple extension. I like to kind of phrase it for athletes as the angle is the direction we're applying our force. How well are we pushing ourselves forward? Whereas the triple extension is kind of the magnitude. If I'm getting a full drive through that leg, I want to get full hip extension. I want to get full knee extension and extension at the ankle. Some coaches, of course, may disagree with that. I've seen the argument that you don't want to necessarily force that full extension because that the like kind of weighing the time it's taking to get that full extension versus cutting out a little short and getting the leg back through faster is going to be given maybe a little bit more advantageous. It just depends on kind of the coach's philosophy. We try to initially coach that and then kind of work on the fly with athletes as we're watching them. But look at that. And then we're taking a look at the front shin angle, which is basically setting up the next contact. Ideally, you want to have that foot strike back behind the body to propel forward. So if we're seeing that foot really start to drift out in front, that's going to lead more to an overstride, and you're going to see a lack of their ability to get force rapidly into the ground. So taking a look at that and then moving it into the top speed phase is really how we evaluate it. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of the force plate technology and stuff like that more advanced stuff. But we can take a look at kind of body weight of the athlete, take a look at the vertical jump, the broad jump, and that can give you already a pretty good idea of their force capacity. Like how much force can they actually put into the ground with those numbers? And then just explaining and kind of walking through the steps to have that translate more through the mechanics. So we don't really have so much of this stuff for hard data in forms of the force play stuff, but we can kind of extrapolate things based on the numbers from other testing and then explain that to the athletes.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things a lot of times people will tell me that the reason they're not assessing or the reason they're not getting as good of an assessment as they want is because, oh, well, we don't have this tech or that
Mhm.
tech, or, you know, we need to spend 30 grand to get this, or we need
Yeah.
whatever it is. And it's like, I really don't feel that way personally. I think
Mhm.
to your point, you can get phenomenal assessments working with whatever you have that way. It's just a matter of how do you put the pieces together into a coherent system
Mhm.
and doesn't miss anything, right? Regardless of if you've got 35 yards of turf, linear space that way to sprint or 100 yards, like you can still get really good data and insights, right? I think a
Mhm.
lot of times we forget about where this profession started, right? Like cones and a stopwatch, right?
Oh,
We've come
yeah.
so much further than that, but that still worked.
Mhm.
Sure, we've got, maybe a more optimal way to do things now, but that doesn't mean the old way doesn't work. I think ultimately, again, as long as you have an assessment process that covers everything you need,
Oh,
you
yeah.
can profile an athlete with anything, even just literally a frickin' iPhone and some cones.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just kind of getting those splits that I talked about, like you can see where an athlete's lacking just by looking at the splits from the start to the 10, the 10 to the 20, 20 to the 30, 30 to the 40. We work with a lot of, like I said earlier, off kind of off the pod. We're in the middle of our combine program right now. So when you look at those splits, you can tell, like, is this athlete really good at acceleration? And then is his top speed kind of starts to fall apart towards the end. And so you're seeing like those times should be going down as he's going over and picking up momentum over the course of the splits. So if I start to see like my start to 10 and my 10 to 20 are starting to go down, my 20 to 30 is say like around a 1.05, and then my 30 to 40 is 1.1. Obviously, there's a discrepancy there where he's not continuing to maintain that speed. He's actually slowing down. So even with just video and a stopwatch and some cones, you can get the differences in those times, see this is where that athlete might be lacking, whether it's in the acceleration, the transition, or the top speed mechanics. And then using the video, you can look at that and be like, okay, pinpoint, this is where you start to overstride. Maybe you're not bringing your hips through all the way. Um, you're not continuing to snap the feet under the ground and be quick off the ground, stuff like that. So you don't need those really heavy technological advances. Obviously, they're cool to have. It's awesome to work with that type of stuff, but it's not, in my view, it's not fully necessary, and it all depends on kind of the resources that you're working with.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on the differences that you're seeing in your experience working with some of those combine athletes compared
Mhm.
to maybe the middle school, high school population in relation to those speed assessments, whether that's differences in acceleration or maybe differences when they start to rise out of that initial acceleration or anything like that that really has jumped out to you as a key difference between maybe the elite athlete and kind of the developing soon to be elite athlete, if you will.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think actually the interesting thing, um, is a lot of you actually see a lot of commonalities between even those elite athletes and younger athletes. So, like one of the big ones you see with some of the combine guys and some of the younger athletes is leaving the hips behind them. Maybe they've just like some of those elite athletes may just be so explosive naturally that they haven't been required to fire the hips all the way, and they're still able to run faster than a lot of the people. But then you still see that with younger athletes as well, and especially with kind of the prevalence of sports performance training and speed development that you see in today's world, the discrepancy I feel like is getting even wider where you can see athletes that come in that may not be as athletic as some of the other combine guys that they're in a group with, but their mechanics are better because they were exposed to that type of training as a kid. But then you get the same combine guys like I mentioned where their mechanics are completely terrible, but they're just so explosive and so athletic of a human being that they can overcompensate for that and still outperform some of the other guys. Whereas you look at younger kids, it's a very similar concept. Like you have kids that naturally kind of adapt faster to the training and kind of pick things up. And then you have kids who are just naturally really explosive, really athletic that are running faster than the kids who pick up the mechanics better because of those kind of tangible athletic abilities. So, really, I would say like outside of just them being older athletes and their learning process being a little bit different. They're a little bit more in tune to their bodies and more ability to kind of accept a cue and then integrate that because they're more comfortable in their bodies. Outside of that stuff, I think there's actually a lot of commonalities between training the two. So it becomes more of like a psychological and personality difference than it does like a physical difference, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah, it does, and one of the things I've seen kinda on the rise for both the high-level professional athlete, but especially the youth athlete as well, I wanna say, is the concept of gamification of the training and adding
Mhm.
competitive elements to it, which on one
Yeah.
hand I like, and I think you can bring out some more of those game type qualities, like game day type qualities in training, which I think is good. But to your point from before, I also think there's a time to be more technical and specific in training since game day is going to be so chaotic that way. How do you balance the two in your own training, right? The gamified speed development versus the very kind of specific or more technical speed development that way?
Sure. So I think, at least in what we do, when we're working with a lot of group training sessions, you kind of gauge it on the fly is how I approach it. So depending on the makeup of the group and how well those athletes are really able to pick up the cues for what you're specifically trying to work on for that day. So if we're working on acceleration, we might be focusing on either early acceleration, the initial takeoff. We'll usually measure that with like 10 yards or the later transition acceleration phase into your top speed where we're testing more of a 20 yards. But those mechanics are going to differ as you get into the different kind of splits. So as athletes are picking up those cues, if they start to pick it up a little bit faster in that specific session, um, you want to then you can kind of it's almost like a reward, like, okay, you guys are doing a great job with this session. Let's add in a little bit of competition, and that can help with that. If athletes are really struggling with picking up some of those fundamental things that you're focusing on for that specific session, then maybe you wouldn't go into as much of a game set type scenario, and you really want to take the time to hammer that. We try to keep our speed sessions within about 30 minutes time frame, including the warm up and the core, a quick little like core routine to get that firing. So within that time constraint, we'll kind of work with that. But I think it can be good to utilize those gamey components to be more like rewarding to the athlete, and that can even help them almost dial in a little bit more if you express that in the beginning of the session, like, hey, you guys work really hard, you kind of focus on getting these components down. We'll go into a little bit of a into more of a competition type thing. We'll test it, but it's going to come down to how much time we have. So you guys have to really dial in for us.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear you say that you're using about a 30-minute duration for
Hmm.
these sessions in length that way, because I feel like a lot of times athletes in particular perceive this need for more, and I think speed training is one of those kind of buckets, if you will, that less actually creates
Hmm.
significantly more, right? Like, we're not trying to cause a conditioning session here. That's
Yes. Yeah.
completely separate. We are trying to get specific adaptations in relation to acceleration. So, how quickly can they get towards that top speed and the actual top speed itself?
Hmm.
That's it. We're not trying to condition anything. We're not trying to turn it into an endurance event. We need to keep the main thing in speed training. And I think a lot of times athletes and parents and sometimes even coaches and clinicians mix the two up and they think
Oh
that,
yeah.
doing more is going to make us faster when in reality sometimes less is more, especially with like the rest periods. Like when we do initial return to sprinting, especially in the clinical populations post
Hmm.
ACL, like I give them like 2 or 3 minutes to rest in between.
Oh
And if
yeah.
we're getting
Hmm.
top end speed, that might not even be enough rest that way. And they're just bored. They're like, when are
Yeah.
you going again? And it's like, look, like we got to let these things recover. It takes
Yeah.
longer than you think.
Well, yeah, I think that if you look at the literature, the exact kind of recommendation is like what 6 seconds for every yard that you're sprinting is what it's technically supposed to be. So that's a full minute if you're running a 10-yard sprint, which can get very kind of boring in between. So we try to, at least myself, I try to go through mechanical stuff and then the kind of implementing it in the last 5 minutes or so. If we're doing acceleration, it's like, all right, we're going to get five good sprints, or we're going to set up the lasers. And as you guys are running, we're going to get times as well. But like we're going to get those sprints in a full minute in between because and you kinda have to explain that to the athletes a lot of times because just like you said, they're just sitting there kinda staring at each other like, "What are we doing here? This feels like a waste of time." So expressing those components and just kind of explaining that really quick, whether in passing or getting the whole group together and be like, "This is why we're waiting this long," is gonna be really helpful for that. Um, And then you can also just try to kind of keep the session a little light. I mean, I feel like a lot of coaches try to get hyper serious with things. Athletes are going to learn if they're in a comfortable environment, right? Like there are obviously those athletes that want to be screamed at. They want to be like super tense when they're training. But I feel like especially for the younger crowd, younger athletes in these days, they tend to be like if you're keeping it a little bit more fun, a little bit more light, and then dialing it in on each rep, that can make the athletes a little bit less likely to be like, what are we doing here? And they're going to adhere to those rest periods a little bit more easily.
Right, absolutely. And you mentioned before, we talked a little bit about the session length, but you also mentioned about doing strength training and
Mhm.
so on that way. Are you doing speed sessions and strength sessions same day? Are they spread apart? Does one come before the other? Or how do you kind of go about approaching those on the day to day?
Yeah, absolutely. So the group sessions that we do, the 30 minutes is just for the speed and agility. After that, we have an hour of strength and conditioning. So every session that we run is an hour and a half long. We begin with an initial dynamic warm up, followed by core. That usually takes in total about 10, maybe 10 to 15, depending on what we're trying to work on that day. From there, we get into some mechanical work, plyometric, beginning with plyometrics and some single response into multi response and then into the mechanical work, and then finishing with some testing. All of that can be very flexible, kind of fluid as the session's going, depending on the number of athletes, stuff like that. From there, every athlete has their own folder with their own program in it. Depend kind of what I spoke to earlier, that more personalized component where it's just based on demands of the sport, based on the specific athlete, what their goals are, what we see in their initial evaluation, any injury history, stuff like that. So from there, they get into those folders and they're going through their lists as the coaches are floating, watching for technique and helping from there. So that's kind of how we structure the sessions. After that, the programming can just depend on the coach's approach and stuff like that. Me as the director, I try to coach up all of the assistant coaches to be able to program in the way that we kind of view as a facility. So, of course, always starting with any extra pre work and stuff like that. Moving into initially a explosive movement, whether it's an Olympic lift, a weighted jump, something along those lines, and then into the main compound movement, whether that's squat, deadlift, bench, incline bench, something like that, or we tend to focus a lot more on unilateral strength training, uh, specifically Hatfield squats, reverse lunges, working on training the imbalances, but also from a speed perspective, in my opinion, training the unilateral strength not only is going to help with being more stable and explosive off each leg individually when contacting the ground, but there's also just more transfer training unilateral strength work. There's more transfer to bilateral than there is training strictly bilateral to unilateral. So, based on the like kind of decrease in the bilateral deficit. So, in my opinion, I'm actually shifting a lot more of my programming, my training into developing the unilateral movements, with some of the like bilateral hip extension type stuff, or knee dominant posterior chain training exercises like leg curls and stuff like that.
So it sounds like as an evolution over the past few years, we're shifting in your approach towards a more heavy single leg dominant side of things. Is
Oh yeah.
that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I would definitely say that. I think there have been some. I mean, as a coach when I started, I was like most kids coming out of college and just trying to get like as big and strong as possible, trying to get the baseline numbers. And then as you kind of learn and you start to learn not only from people that you're working with, but also from just having the certification and doing the recertification units and stuff like that, looking at watching seminars and all that, you start to adapt your training to all that stuff. So um yeah, I think I almost limited myself when I was younger and focusing more on the compound movements. But then as just in my experience over the years, kind of transitioning to more of the unilateral strength training, uh, getting seeing more results for my athletes. And not only that, but then focusing on even smaller things like loading the ankle more and developing strength in the kind of foot ankle complex for contact with the ground, interaction with the ground, all that stuff. You just kind of evolve your own coaching philosophy over time.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel that a lot of individuals are kind of in that position where they're looking on what their next evolution in their framework is going to be. And at least for
Mhm.
myself, my whole process is I always self experiment
Mhm.
before I implement it with anyone that I work with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. That's
What are we feeling when we do this? How do we feel? Is it too much? Is it enough? Is it just right? And I feel like you might be slower to implement it as a result of that. But when you
Mhm.
do implement it, you're speaking from personal experience instead of just what the literature would say. So I'm a
Mhm.
huge fan of self-experimenting before you implement it with a group that way. And the other piece, I leave about 5 to 10% of a session. It doesn't matter if it's my own session, a physical therapy session, an online
Mhm.
performance session, whatever we're talking about here, the last 5 to 10% of it is very, very open. I call it freestyle, recess, movement vocabulary.
Mhm.
It's any one of 100 different aims that way, but essentially, we just use that time to try something new.
Okay.
And I think that there is so much value in leaving literally just like 3 to 5 minutes each session to try something new, right? Like, hey, we're gonna try a new exercise or a new superset, a new finisher, whatever it is that way. And I think if you have that process of self-experimenting, but also constantly trying something new with yourself and everyone you work with, you have this ever evolving learning process already built into your system. So it's not just go to a conference, learn all this stuff, and immediately apply it. It's like, hey, we're going to take that and now we're going to actually run it through our test battery that I just outlined and make sure it fits what we're after.
Yeah, I actually really like yeah, I'd never considered that, but I couldn't agree the idea of the 3 to 5 minute kind of freestyle at the end of it. But yeah, I completely agree. I think it's really interesting to see coaches where they don't actually train the way that they're trying to train their athletes. Like it depends on kind of your own personal philosophy, but I completely agree with you. I I try not to give anything to my athletes if I haven't at least tried it myself. One of the biggest examples just off the top of my head was like I started implementing French contrast training into my programming. I was working, I myself was doing stuff like that for 2 months, 3 months prior to even giving it to athletes because I wanted to see that I was going to get the same or like the desired results out of it prior to giving it to them. Um, so I think, and even the unilateral stuff we do, I do a lot of like heel elevated unilateral work, like having just focusing on staying on the ball of the foot, having the doing like a Bulgarian where you're doing more of a vertical drop down, your knees coming out over the toes more, or similar to like a reverse lunge, stuff like that. It's stressing the knee a lot more, it's stressing the quad a lot more, it's stressing the ankle a lot more. If I didn't do that myself, then when my athletes come to me and are like, hey, I'm starting to feel a little bit of tension, like I haven't felt this feeling before in my quad or in my knee, I myself wouldn't have known really how to handle that, right? So I know where that's coming from. Okay, maybe we need to back off some of the weight, focus on doing a little bit more reps to develop the adaptation, and also develop a little bit more flexibility, mobility in the ankle and in the hip complex to reduce any sort of torque going through the knee. So doing that stuff yourself is going to be really important to then being able to empathize and coach up the athletes on how to do it properly. Not only just kind of thinking back on how when you were doing the exercise, what were you focusing on? When I'm doing a reverse lunge, I'm focusing on keeping my weight over my front leg, doing more like a single leg squat as my back leg comes back and stabilizes. You'll see a lot of athletes where they step back and they shift their weight all the way back, and that throws off their balance. It takes the stress off the front leg that you're trying to focus on. If I wasn't doing that myself and I just sort of threw reverse lunges into a program, I might not have had that kind of revelation to myself. So it's really important to practice those things, kind of practice what you preach, and it's always fascinating to me when I see coaches who aren't doing that. And of course, everyone kind of has their own logic and reasoning to things, but it's just my own personal opinion. I think it's extremely important and like kind of pivotal to your coaching career.
Absolutely, and it allows you that time to self-reflect and think like, "Hey, if this didn't work, but the research said it should,
Mhm.
why didn't it work? Is it,
Yeah. Mhm.
something outside of my control or some external factor outside of training, or
Mhm.
is it the actual training itself?" And,
Yeah.
going
Of
to
course.
the French contrast example specifically that way, when I initially was playing around with that, I felt
Mhm.
like I made the mistake of not making the first compound, like the heavy one, heavy
Mhm.
enough for
Yeah.
people.
Mhm.
Like, it needs to be, like, according to the literature, correct me if I'm wrong, about 90% 1 rep max. Like,
Yeah.
this
It's
is not
supposed to
like
be super
a
heavy.
70-75% load here, and I
Mhm.
think a lot of times I didn't load that enough to really get the full bang for my buck
Yeah.
from that style of training. And I think the other thing I've seen a lot of coaches doing with this lately, and I haven't tried it myself yet, so take this with a grain of salt, but their French contrast, their four movements that they're doing to me look drastically different. Like
Yeah.
for me, I might do like a heavy squat movement followed by like a double leg like jump of some sort and so on
Mhm.
from there, right? They're doing something more like, hey, we're going to do a heavy squat and then we're going to do a jump lunge and then we're going to do and so on from there. And
Yeah.
I've always kind of kept it as specific to one pattern as I could, but I'm seeing a lot more where they're kind of swapping patterns in and out within
Mhm.
that kind of set of four, if you will. And I haven't played around with that yet. It might be
Yeah.
great. It might be, I don't know. But it's just one of those things that I think all of this stuff can work really well. Going back to what we said earlier about how there's so many different ways to make athletes faster. It can
Mhm.
ultimately what works and why does it work at the end of the day.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, one of the things uh I've been playing around with on the French contrast method is the because the literature does say like it should be upwards of 90% of the 1 rep max, like 2 to 3 reps, super, super heavy. One thing I've been playing around for is actually 5 reps where the weight on the bar is closer to like 80%, but then you're putting bands on there. So you're getting the variable resistance where it's ramping up to about 90% at the end range of the movement. But in the bottom, you can focus on like the resistance kind of lessens to around 80%. So that you're able to focus on the amortization phase being more efficient and then seeing how that transitions over to the more explosive movements. So for myself, like a banded box squat, and then going into a dumbbell squat jump, or sorry, banded box squat into a tuck jump, into a dumbbell squat jump, multi response dumbbell squat jump, and into a band assisted jump, adding the bands to that initial compound movement where it's reaching the really heavy portion at the back end of the movement at the end range. Uh, I've found that it's helping me with the other exercises down the road. You're still priming the amortization phase in the dip and drive to be faster with some resistance, but then you're getting more of that final drive at takeoff is going to be more ramped up. So it's interesting to kind of play with that. And then to your point, I've seen videos on Instagram and stuff of people trying to develop like French contrast for upper body power, and they're doing a super heavy bench and then plyo push-ups, but then they're doing like a push press, a vertical push press with it. I'm like, but that's not the whole point of the literature states that you want the most similar movement patterns to get that transfer. So if I'm doing all horizontal pressing, but then I in the middle of it I switch to a vertical press, like yeah, the deltoids are still getting involved in both movements, but you're not necessarily having a similar movement pattern. So I don't know if there's any backing to that. I don't know if those people are getting like really good results out of it. I haven't experimented it with myself, but it's just interesting to see like uh, whether they're just kind of like throwing stuff at a wall and seeing what happens and then putting that online, or they're just like, oh, I'm actually getting results, but it's not really as well explained in the caption or something like that. So it is interesting to see how people kind of change their applications, and myself included with the bandit example. But yeah, the thing with fitness that's so fascinating to me is this. There's a million ways to skin a cat, right? You can get similar results from drastically different approaches, but then it's how those approaches work in the confines of like do you have a very specific training time frame that you have to get done? Like we have the hour and a half training sessions, the stuff like that. So how are you working those things in? If you have 3 hours a day to just go into the weight room and get as much done as possible, you have a lot. Like maybe you could get the exact same results as someone who's getting those results in like an hour time frame. But which one would be deemed more efficient? In my opinion, it's what you're getting done in an hour as opposed to three. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And one of the other things I've played around with quite a bit is the isometric plyometric superset, not for a French
Mhm.
contrast, just a strict contrast that way, if you will. And that was something we discussed extensively last year with Danny Lum, who's a
Mhm.
guru about all of that stuff that way. And it's interesting because on one hand, I feel like the isometrics have a ton of potential in this
Mhm.
space, especially on the RFD side, but on the other hand, I think, and I might have been guilty of this myself, I think as great as isometrics are, isometrics are not the only thing that you should be doing, right? We
Yeah.
need to
Oh
do
yeah.
other things. We need to do plyometrics. We need to move under a barbell. We need to
Mhm.
move under load. Like, I think as great as the rise of isometrics has been, and again, I might even be guilty of maybe promoting this too heavily myself that way. Isometrics are great. I do them all the time. However, there is more to the puzzle than just isometrics.
Mhm.
And you
Absolutely.
cannot just be doing isometrics for RFD. You cannot just be doing isometrics expecting to see all this stuff improve. There's a lot more than just doing and overcoming ISO.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And I think even that is kind of a flaw with a lot of coaches and myself when I was younger is you get so kind of um entranced by this one training philosophy that you just become hyper focused on it and you don't actually apply other components. You want to be as well rounded of a coach as possible and be able to integrate as many different approaches as possible. But I feel like a lot of different people start to get so hyper fixated on like, wow, I really like the results I'm getting here that you actually end up limiting the results down the line because you're not open to other training modalities. So I think it's really important to keep your mind open to different things and acknowledge like, okay, this might not be working to the to as it, I know you said you don't like the word optimize, but right as like I'm not getting the most out of my training. I'm not optimizing that component because I'm so hyper fixated on one modality over the other or something like that. So
Absolutely, yeah, and I think the other piece too, Tim Karen's book, The Strength Deficit, was absolutely incredible. I've got a printed copy in the other room and a digital copy, so I've always got one where I go, and one of the things he discusses extensively is the eccentric component, and I think a lot of times with speed and sprint work and chasing a better acceleration or chasing better force development or whatever it is, we're
mhm.
always chasing the outputs, right? We're chasing
Yeah.
the concentric moment, but a lot of that stuff, we need to have the eccentric capacity
Mhm.
first. And ultimately, I think it was Pat Lewis who used the analogy on the podcast of comparing eccentric and concentric to a bottle of water, right? And
Yeah.
eccentric emphasis or improving eccentric strength increases the size of the bottle so that we're able to pour more water, which is the concentric, within it that way. And I
Mhm.
love that analogy. And I've recently in my own training started to incorporate more yielding isometrics,
Yeah.
some PQIs, and some just like longer drawn out eccentrics to try and build more of that deficit between the eccentric and concentric. And I've noticed a huge benefit from that myself and a huge
Mhm.
benefit from that in athlete rehabs, especially when we start building that very early on and we just continue to go all in on that long term, right? Like they're just so good at decelerating, so good at pumping the brakes that
Mhm.
when it comes time to like push force into the ground, like it makes a huge difference in my
Oh,
opinion.
yeah.
I could be biased on that, but I've seen amazing things when you just build so much of an eccentric deficit in
Mhm.
specific athlete cases.
Yeah, definitely, and I know there's both from the strength development side, kind of approaching that first, like, you'll see it with younger athletes all the time. You see them with, say, bench press is a perfect example. Once you start transitioning kids from dumbbell bench to regular bench press, one of the most common things, at least I've personally seen, is that you'll see athletes almost like dropping the bar on their chest, and then you tell them, "Okay, let's control it down a little bit more," and even just cueing that allows them to get more out of the concentric phase because they're getting more out of the eccentric phase, building some more of that tension up through the muscle to get a little bit more of that elastic component involved as well. So you're getting that on the strength conditioning side, but I know there's been research into the speed development side and taking a look at focusing on more uh, isometric, eccentric, and concentric. And this what the research at least I had read showed was when you focus more on the eccentric component, that gives you more benefits to your sprint speed because you're better able to interact with the ground and get off the ground faster to decelerate and then recelerate faster in those movements. Whereas if I'm only focusing on the concentric portion, yeah, I'm going to have a really explosive push off, but then I'm more likely to cave under my own contact, which is going to make me take longer to get off the ground, which is going to put me in a position where I'm dealing with more friction and braking forces, and then it's more to overcompensate for. So all of those things, like when you look at those in the research that I've at least read, it's when you focusing more on some eccentric component. If you were to weight it more eccentric, isometric, concentric, you would have more transfer to speed development if you focus a little bit more on the eccentric portion than you would on the isometric or the concentric portion.
Yeah, and I think initially, at least for myself, when I emphasized the eccentric heavily, one of the big mistakes I made there was, once again, not loading it heavy
Yeah.
enough, right? Like,
Yeah.
and it's one of those things I think weight releasers have made a big comeback, which I love, but
Mhm.
you can also do the what I call the poor man's weight releaser, and you just throw an extra plate on and then have someone on the sides to pull it off. But I
Yeah.
think intentionally overloading the eccentric and really building a robust athlete from a ability to slow down and pump the brakes will
Mhm.
make it so much easier for them to throttle up when the time is called.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, one thing, unfortunately, I've never been able to work with I've never had at my disposal the releasers. Those things look awesome, but I've just never had an opportunity to work with them. My boss had a pair of them, but they were super old. I think some pieces of them were missing or something like that, like the pins or something. Um, when I started working at the facility I'm at now. But one thing I have been incorporating on more of, especially for um, like athletes that specifically want to get bigger, stronger in their upper bodies is doing more like 2 sets of 5 eccentric where they're focusing on controlling the eccentric portion and exploding through the concentric. And then the last set of the 3 sets that they're programmed for is 3 reps um, at or a little over 100% max, and then the coach is pulling the bar up or helping to pull the bar up so that you're getting that overloading aspect for not only the musculature, but also the central nervous system. And then that's priming them for the next time they come around to that session. They're going to get a little bit more of that kind of like super compensation aspect for that same exercise. So that's something that I've been working on. It's a little tougher to do that with more of the lower body exercises like squat and deadlift. Where the coach is going to have to I mean, mainly deadlift. I would probably never do that with deadlift unless you're having them pick it up off the rack to start. But with squat, like you'd have to be as a coach willing to basically front squat your athlete to get them out of the bottom portion. So the bench press is just one of the biggest exercises that I'm using it for right now. But I am starting to see a lot of good results, not just with myself doing that, but also with my athletes um, improving their strength and their bench press control on other sets that are a little bit more submaximal.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely, man. And I feel like just to kind of bring it full circle, we've discussed the training extensively, the assessments extensively. What's the typical week to week block look like for you from a speed training emphasis that way? Or how much time between sessions are we allowing and so on that way? And how much volume intra session that way are we getting?
So we'll start with the athletes. So with all my athletes, it really just depends on their schedules. And the programming is going to be based on that. So if they're doing a 1, 2, or 3 day a week program, ideally they're getting a full day of rest in between their workouts because we're hitting speed and strength in both of those workouts. And each one of those lifts, we're doing full body. If they, for whatever reason, they have a strict schedule, they're not able to do that with the day of rest in between, then we can program where it's like say like they do a Monday, Tuesday, and then come on Thursday or something or Friday, it would be an upper body, lower body, and then full body at the end of the week. So we're really flexible with that. If they're coming more than that, it's an upper lower split. And then the volume is depending on the frequency at which they're coming after that and the time in the season and everything like that. So there's a ton of those variables that come in. Myself personally, I used to do heavy lifting and speed 6 days a week. I just killed at this point. I'm 34. I'll be 35 in June. I can't really do that anymore. So I can't. So I actually recently transitioned to a 3 day program. Um, but the way that I've kind of played around with it and what I'm doing right now is that my Monday lift is I only lift on 3 days and I only do speed on the other 3 days. My Monday lift is more power focused, lower body with max strength focus, upper body. My middle of the day my Wednesday lift is more max strength, lower body with like explosive movement, like banded work and stuff like that for the upper body. And then my last day, my Friday lift is more volume for everything. I'm trying to get a lot more reps. I'm doing a lot more exercises for each muscle group, but the sets per exercise is down from 3 to 2. So that I'm getting a lot of volume, but for each specific exercise, it's like two good challenging sets of high volume for each thing. Um, and then I kind of moved in the last program I've been doing. I moved from my upper body is more volume to stimulate that hypertrophy component. And then all the lower body exercises I do on my fourth day are actually now more contrast or just trying to keep the weight relatively light and move it really explosively. Because by the end of the week, my with the days of speed and the heavier liftings, by the time I get to Friday, my body's pretty much torched. So I'm just like, all right, I'm just focused on the movement and not loading super heavy.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's one of those things. It's funny because just like we were talking about before, things have evolved over time. It sounds like that's evolved for you
Oh
over time as well, right? Like,
big time,
and
big time.
it's so interesting because I see so many different approaches to putting this all together. I've seen
Mhm.
higher frequency during the week with shorter, less intense sessions. It's like, hey, we're gonna get in, do these 2 or 3 things, and then get out, which
Mhm.
if you can do that, great. But I've also seen a lot more doing it kinda like you're doing it that way. So I think ultimately
Yeah.
whatever works best for you at the end of the day. I
Mhm.
realize we probably talk about this all day long, Andrew. Is there anything we missed or didn't chat about today in relation to speed that you wanted to?
Um, not really. I would just say kind of a footnote, like, for any athlete, any coaches or anything that are watching that's kind of looking for anything that's going to help them get better. There's a lot of resources that I've read, and I know one of my with any interns and stuff that I get working under me, one of their number one questions is like, what are some things that I can look at to help me learn more periodization, but also more speed mechanics and getting comfortable with the positioning and the biomechanics to go into it. So I think just some of those things I really one of the books that I've actually read more recently, and even then, with the more experience that I've had over the years coaching, I found it super helpful. Is like Language of Coaching by Nick Winkelman. I don't know if you've read that,
Yeah.
but really just talking about the differences and the advantages to external coaching or external cues over internal cues. And even me implementing more of that into my coaching the athletes that I work with, I've seen a lot of um, beneficial effect with that, where they're starting to pick things up better than they were before I had read the book and started implementing some of that stuff. Then one of the best things I think, the mechanics of sprinting and hurdling by Ralph Mann and Amber Murphy. That was one of the best ones for just kind of. There's a lot of things that are really great for. There's a lot of diagrams and stuff, specifically laying out the body position and the biomechanics involved in sprint mechanics and then hurdling mechanics for any track athletes you're working with. And then from the periodization standpoint, uh, periodization training for sport by Tuda Bompa and Carlo Mezzacelli, I think is how you pronounce the name. That was really kind of pivotal in me learning all the different periodization styles for a lot of different sports. They lay out a lot of different strategies from the macro, meso, and micro cycles for different sports seasons, but also just looking at a lot of Kramer's work on undulating periodization has been really important as well. Seeing as how that just based on research can be one of the most effective forms of periodizing for your athletes. So I think just for any younger coaches kind of coming up, those are some of the books that I wish I had read much earlier, specifically The Language of Coaching. But it's all been very helpful for me developing as a coach, and I'm sure other coaches coming up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more. And to your point on Winkleman that way, I felt like, and this was a few years ago that I did the XPS, and I don't know if
Mhm.
they've updated it or changed it, but when I took it, Winkleman was a very big component of that course that way. And that was probably one of the best bang for my buck, best, dollar ROI, I guess I'll call it, online CEU courses I've taken that way. So I
Mhm.
highly recommend that one. And to your point, ultimately, there's a lot of great books and resources and things out there. You just have to be willing to put the time in and do
Oh
the
yeah.
work that
Mhm.
it takes that way. And your willingness to do that will separate you from being a good and a great coach.
Mhm.
Obviously, you've put a lot of your hours in. The 10,000 hour things have been surpassed a long time ago for you that way. And that's what it takes for people who want to find out more about you, Andrew, and even, use you as a resource that way and reach out with questions. Where can they find you online and that sort of thing?
For sure. So you can find me on Instagram. I have my own coaching page at Coach Drew TPA, Coach Drew Tampa. And then if anyone interested in the facility that I'm working as director of, it's at Cooper Sports at Cooper underscore sports performance. So that's at Coach Drew TPA and at Cooper underscore sports performance. You'll see a lot of this stuff with myself and my athletes that I'm working with at both those pages. So other than that, uh, yeah, just reach out to me. That's really the only spot. I don't really have like a Twitter or anything. It's kind of toxic in my mind. I had to get off of it when I had it. So
Yeah.
yeah, those are the best spots.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I try and keep the social media as simple as possible. So link to all of that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there. Catch Andrew everywhere online. This was awesome, dude. Thanks for your time.
No, yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.